So today what I want to talk about is the economics of coronavirus. Now, economics is traditionally thought of as this subject about money, jobs, inflation rates, etc. But it's about much more than that. Okay, and what I want to do is go through sort of the standard approach that most of you are probably thinking about when we talk about the economics of coronavirus, and then go through sort of a different approach as well. So we'll start off with a macroeconomic explanation. And then we'll move into a microeconomic explanation. Okay, so let's dive into the macro one. Okay, now the macroeconomics of COVID-19 are perhaps some of the most interesting and challenging things that we've ever seen. So in macroeconomics, the canonical model is what we call the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And basically what it looks like is this. We have on the y-axis, we have the price level, and on the x-axis, we have GDP. Okay, and we have an aggregate demand curve, a short run aggregate supply curve, and then we have sort of a long run aggregate supply curve as well. Now, for those unfamiliar, the aggregate demand curve, it can be thought of as basically the propensity of people to spend their money, right? So the aggregate demand curve captures total consumer spending at various price levels, right? It's basically a measure, or it's a way of talking about how much stuff consumers purchase. The aggregate supply curves, so these two aggregate supply curves here, what they like to talk about, or what they do talk about, is production, right? So in macroeconomics, aggregate demand is basically consumption, and aggregate supply is production. And where the lines all cross, well, at that point, consumption right here has to have a situation where consumption is equal to production. In other words, we are producing things that we are actually consuming. Okay, and so the difference between the short run here and the long run here, the difference lies in sort of what we call the time horizon. To make it easy, the long run, okay, so long run aggregate supply is basically how much stuff can be produced, given, for example, the amount of natural resources, the capital stock, which is just a measure of all the capital or tools or anything like that you want to think about. You could think about factories as capital, and the labor force. The short run aggregate supply is more flexible, right? It's a little bit more like today versus tomorrow, right? It's not really the same thing as the long run. Okay, and so what we've got, so let me erase some of this stuff so I've got some more room to write. So what we have is a situation that is perhaps the most unique. Now, let's kind of do, let's say we'll do an example of the financial crisis in 2008 so that we can get some comparisons here. Okay, so in 2008, here's kind of what we saw. Right, we have sort of our normal state of the world, right, where everything seems to be good, and then sort of the financial crisis hits, and we had a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve that resulted in a recession. Okay, so here, we had less production happening, right? And as a result of that, lots of people lost their jobs. So because of the decrease in consumption, because remember, aggregate demand is consumption. Because of the decrease in consumption, we saw a decrease in production. And that decrease in production is what led to the unemployment that we experienced during the Great Recession. Okay. What's different about COVID-19 is there was not a reduction in the short run aggregate. Whoops. Let's try that graph again. What's different about COVID-19 is that there wasn't a reduction in aggregate demand that spurred sort of this change in the what we call the business cycle that caused a recession. What we instead saw, because so many people in Wuhan, China, and around the world today have gotten sick and are no longer able to come to work, and because of social distancing mandates and other things like that, and shutting down businesses that are deemed non-essential, what we see instead is a decrease in the short run aggregate supply. Right? So we see a short run in what we are producing today. And so now what we have is less GDP being produced, or less production happening in the world economy and in every nation's economy. We still have the same amount of consumer demand, right? Because aggregate demand hasn't really changed a whole lot. And what's happening now is because of this recession, because of this leftward shift of the short run aggregate supply curve, more and more people are being shut out of the labor force. Now, complicating this is that when people get laid off, what ends up happening is they end up spending less money. And that makes sense, and that's wise. I don't want to conflate this. I don't want to obfuscate this at all. Right? It is wise when you are experiencing a layoff or when you don't have work, it is wise for you to spend less. But what happens when you do that? Okay, so notice that right here, we are in a recession because we are to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve. What's happening now, the second wave that's happening, is we're having a decrease in aggregate demand as well. Okay, so aggregate demand is shifting to the left. And that's moving our equilibrium point to here, where perhaps the price level has not changed. Right? So notice that the price levels between the original equilibrium point and the current equilibrium point are roughly the same, right? But now the recession is that much deeper, right? We've instead shifted over here. Now, what Congress in the United States is attempting to do is to try to boost aggregate demand by providing some sort of a stimulus package, right? And what this would do is it would shift aggregate demand to the right, and it would hopefully get us back onto our old aggregate demand curve, or perhaps even higher, right? To get us up to some sort of a long run equilibrium where we're back out of a recession, right? Because even if we moved, so notice, even if we moved to, here, we just move this much, we're not going to get to our old equilibrium. We're not going to get to we're not going to end this recession. We're just going to get to this point here. So in order to make the recession end, we have to move aggregate demand not just to, here. We've got to move aggregate demand all the way out here. That's going to require a massive spending package or very loose monetary policy, which is exactly what we see. Okay? And so the traditional tools of macroeconomics might prove to be impotent at trying to end the recession that way. Okay? But this is the picture that's going on right now, is we've moved from our original equilibrium point here all the way down to this equilibrium here. And this right here is the recession. Okay, so this is the source of sort of the economic pain that we're all experiencing, at least from a macroeconomic perspective. But we can examine this also from a microeconomic perspective. which I think is perhaps more fruitful. Okay, so here, what we're going to look at is the division of labor. Now, every day, you and I both rely on the collective efforts of millions of people all around the world. Some of you might be thinking about like supply chains, and that's perfectly fine, and that's a part of this. But it goes beyond just supply chains, right? This is talking about like how we live our everyday lives. Okay, so I'll share some insights into like my household. So in my lifetime or in my day, right? Prior to COVID-19, my schedule was to drop, baby off at daycare and go to work. Now I don't get to do that, right? So this no longer happening, right? I have to watch my baby all day, which I should be clear, I love doing this. But it means I have less time to be an econ professor, right? Because some of my day is spent caring for my child, right? Some of my day is locked up with him sleeping on my shoulder, which is adorable. However, while he's sleeping on my shoulder, I can't be grading assignments. I can't be creating content, right? I can't be emailing my students. I have to keep my son asleep on my shoulder so that he can get his nap time in, okay? And so we can also think about differences in how other things in our lives are going. So we are no longer able to perhaps have cleaning people come in, right? So now we have to clean our own homes, right? We can't go to the movies. No, let's call this external entertainment. Right? We can't go to the movies. We can't go out and hang out with friends, right? We have to do everything ourselves. And so our ability to enjoy the division of labor is greatly reduced, right? We now have to serve as the home instructors to our children. We have to be the person that cleans our house. We have to be the person that mows our lawn. We have to be the person that takes care of literally everything around the house that we ordinarily might have hired someone else to do and instead gone to work. And so what's going on here is there is a lack of specialization in our households, or at the very least, a severe diminishment of specialization. Now everyone has to be essentially self-sufficient, right? Now there are tremendous opportunities to enjoy the division of labor. You can still order food from restaurants, right? You can still, in some places, you can even order curbside pickup of beer from local breweries, right? You can still do these things, but they're no longer nearly as easy, and to do them carries the potential risk of infection. And so people are doing less of them because the cost of doing so has gone up. Now, we also have a few other things that are going on. Now, in normal markets, right, during times of crisis, when we have sort of a demand and a supply, we have our price and our quantity, right, we normally describe this as our equilibrium point right here. And it carries with it, some price level, okay? And during times of crisis, the demand for things such as toilet paper, toothpaste, Q-tips, any type of product like that, or canned goods, anything of that sort, the demand for that product will increase. Okay, so the demand shifts to the right. We have a new equilibrium point here that, yes, is at a higher price level, but notice that it's also at a higher quantity. And so what this price signal here, what this increase in the price does, is it sends a signal to businesses that says, hey, if you can find a way to increase the production of these goods for which the demand has increased, then you can make a higher amount of profit, right? And that is really the thrust of what the price system does. The price system economizes on the acquisition of information. It helps people figure out what it is that's actually needed and what it is that people want during extraordinary times. Okay, so you let the price rise, the quantity will increase as well, and everything seems to be going great. However, in a lot of cities and a lot of states in the US, we have anti-price gouging laws. Okay, and what that does is it places what we call a price ceiling on the price of what are things that are deemed to be essential goods. And so we say, hey, it is illegal to raise the price above whatever it used to be. Okay, and here's kind of the rub of it. When the price isn't allowed to rise, what we call the quantity supplied doesn't it really increase, right? It stays about the same. However, the demand has still increased, right? This demand shift is still real. And so at this price here, let me clean up some stuff here. At this price here, the quantity demanded is much, much higher, right? Because of the increase in demand. So I'll call this Q3. So what we have here is a situation where the quantity demanded is far greater than the quantity supplied. And so what happens is we have what's known as a shortage. Okay? Now this leads to familiar lessons in hoarding, familiar lessons in the scarce or difficult ability to find even just basic goods. Toilet paper serves as a great example. I personally don't understand why toilet paper has been so hard to come by at the stores. It's not like coronavirus causes diarrhea or anything like that, but people have been flocking to stores to try to stock up on toilet paper. Well, okay, that means the demand for toilet paper has increased. Under normal circumstances, the price would increase and the quantity supplied would increase as well. But in today's world, where we're not allowed to raise the price, where we're stuck at this price here, this P1, the quantity supplied stays the same. In other words, Charmin and other toilet paper making companies aren't going to increase the production of toilet paper because they're not going to earn any additional money from doing so. The quantity demanded, however, increases dramatically, and so stores run out of toilet paper very, very quickly. We see people trying to hoard as much toilet paper as they can. In my community, what's been really interesting is to see people selling quarter rolls of toilet paper on Facebook Marketplace for $15. Right? So a quarter roll is selling on Facebook right now in my community for $15. That's crazy, right? And why is that happening? Well, the demand has increased. Like this demand shift is real, right? But the price at the store is not allowed to shift. And this leads to familiar things like hoarding, right? Eventually, in some communities, we see rationing. At the Meijer, which is a Michigan brand of grocery store, we actually see um, we actually see the Meijer placing um, rolls or packs of toilet paper in each shopping cart and then pushing the shopping carts together so that people can only get one roll at a time, right? Which is an interesting solution to the problem, but it doesn't solve the production problem. Okay. And then, most perniciously, we see in lots of examples cases of what we call secondary markets. Okay, so here we're seeing people selling toilet paper at exorbitant prices on Craigslist, on Facebook Marketplace, perhaps even on eBay. I'd have to check eBay to see if that's happening. But these are all consequences of price controls. So, if we want to remove these consequences, we need to remove the price controls. We need to let markets work. We need to allow the price of toilet paper and other essentials to rise, because that is what induces the increased production, right? And by doing so, we can allow people to have the toilet paper that they want. The added benefit of this is that by letting the price of toilet paper rise, not only do we increase the production, we also reduce the consumption by the people who happen to get to the grocery store first, right? Which means that there won't be empty shelves where the toilet paper ought to have been. There will be shelves that are instead stocked with toilet paper so that we see people getting the toilet paper that they actually need.